You should probably stop worrying about family dinners, Margaret, my daughter-in-law said with a smile while passing the mashed potatoes. At your age, quiet evenings are healthier anyway. Everyone at the table laughed softly after she said it. Everyone except me. My son kept staring down at his plate like the gravy somehow deserved more attention than his own mother. I smiled politely and folded my napkin across my lap because after 69 years of life, I had learned something important about humiliation. The loudest wounds are rarely the deepest ones. I am glad you are here. Stay with me until the end and tell me where you are watching from, because sometimes strangers understand loneliness better than family does. Sunday dinners used to mean something in our house. Back when my husband Walter was alive, the dining room felt warm in a way that had nothing to do with food. The old chandelier above the table always glowed softly against the wallpaper while laughter bounced through the house from room to room. Walter carved the dining table himself during the winter of 1994. Oak wood, thick legs, slight scratch marks near the corner where Ethan dropped a toolbox, helping his father move it inside. Every Sunday evening, the table filled with casseroles, pie dishes, extra chairs, and too many stories, all spoken at once. But after Walter died 3 years ago, something shifted quietly inside this family. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just slowly enough that I kept convincing myself I imagined it. Claire Hayes entered our lives with perfect posture, soft cashmere sweaters, and the kind of smile magazines teach women to wear. She never raised her voice. Never insulted anyone openly. That was what made her so difficult to explain to other people. Claire specialized in making cruelty sound practical. Margaret probably needs more rest. Margaret gets overwhelmed easily now. Margaret does not like too much noise. Every sentence sounded caring on the surface. Helpful even. But over time, I noticed something unsettling. Decisions started happening around me instead of with me. Family trips, holiday plans, even conversations stopped when I entered the room. The dining room looked beautiful that particular Sunday evening. Claire had decorated the table with cream candles and eucalyptus branches she bought from an expensive boutique downtown. Soft jazz played from hidden speakers in the kitchen while snow drifted quietly outside the windows. Ethan sat across from me wearing the same tired expression he had carried for months now. My granddaughter Lily colored quietly beside the fireplace, while Claire moved gracefully between the kitchen and dining room refilling glasses before anyone asked. To an outsider, we probably looked like one of those perfect suburban families from holiday commercials. But perfection can feel strangely cold when it is carefully managed. Halfway through dinner, I noticed something unusual. Ethan's phone buzzed beside his plate. He glanced down quickly before turning the screen face down against the table. Claire looked at him immediately. Not casually. Not curiously. Intentionally. Then she smiled at me. "Lily has her school concert next Thursday," she said brightly. "The auditorium might be difficult for you, though. Lots of stairs." I blinked slowly. I attended every one of Ethan's school concerts for 12 years. Claire laughed softly as though I had made a charming little joke. "Of course you did. But things are different now." Different now. Those two words lingered in the air long after the conversation moved on. A few minutes later, Lily looked up innocently from her coloring book near the fireplace. "Mommy says Grandma might move somewhere quieter soon." The entire dining room froze. Ethan dropped his fork against the plate with a sharp metallic sound. Claire's smile flickered for only half a second before returning perfectly into place. "Lily," she said calmly, "we do not interrupt adult conversations." But my heartbeat had already started climbing painfully inside my chest. I looked directly at my son. "Move where?" Ethan rubbed his forehead without meeting my eyes. "Nobody is talking about anything serious, Mom." Nobody. Another careful word. Another polished dismissal. Claire reached for the wine bottle and poured more into Ethan's glass before answering for him. "We have simply been discussing future options. Larger families need practical plans." Larger families. Practical plans. She spoke about my life the way people discuss furniture arrangements before remodeling a house. I glanced around the dining room at the flickering candles, the polished silverware, the smiling family photographs hanging beside the staircase. Everything looked beautiful, warm, perfect. And suddenly I realized something terrifying. Families only work this hard to look happy when they are hiding something underneath the table. After dinner ended that night, I stayed behind in the kitchen pretending to organize leftovers while Claire and Ethan moved quietly through the living room, putting on coats for Lily. Snow tapped softly against the windows above the sink while the dishwasher hummed low beneath the counter. Claire wrapped slices of pie into neat plastic containers with the same calm precision she applied to everything else in life. "You really should let me hire someone to help you around the house," she said casually without looking at me. "This place is probably exhausting to manage alone." I placed silverware carefully into the sink before answering. "I have lived in this house for 41 years. I think I can still manage my own kitchen." Claire smiled faintly. "Of course." There it was again. That soft tone. That careful politeness hiding something colder underneath. Ethan barely spoke while helping Lily zip her winter coat near the front door. Before leaving, he hugged me quickly, distracted already. "We will call you tomorrow, Mom." But he did not meet my eyes when he said it. After they left, silence settled heavily through the house. Not peaceful silence. Empty silence. The kind that reminds you how large rooms become once laughter disappears from them. I stood alone in the dining room, staring at the half-burned candles Claire arranged earlier that evening. Their wax had melted unevenly across the polished oak table Walter built with his own hands decades ago. I ran my fingers slowly along the scratches near the corner where Ethan once dropped a hammer, helping his father during summer repairs. That scratch used to make Walter laugh every time he noticed it. "Proof the boy actually tried helping for once," he would joke. The memory hit harder than I expected. I sat down slowly in Walter's old chair at the head of the table while wind rattled softly outside. 3 years without him. 3 years watching this house grow quieter piece by piece. The strangest part about grief is how ordinary it becomes eventually. People imagine widowhood as dramatic crying and endless sadness. But most days it feels smaller than that. It feels like reaching for 2 coffee mugs before remembering you only need one. It feels like hearing good news and having nobody beside you to tell first. It feels like Sunday dinners where everyone still smiles, but the warmth somehow never reaches you anymore. Upstairs, the hallway remained exactly as Walter left it. His old navy jacket still hung inside the bedroom closet beside mine because I could never quite bring myself to move it. His reading glasses still rested inside the nightstand drawer. Sometimes late at night, I opened that drawer just to hear the familiar rattle of them against the wood. I climbed the stairs slowly that evening, pausing halfway when I noticed light glowing faintly beneath the guest room door. Claire and Ethan occasionally stayed overnight during snowstorms with Lily. I frowned because I distinctly remembered turning the light off earlier that morning. Quietly, I pushed the door open. The room looked mostly untouched except for one thing. Several cardboard boxes sat stacked beside the bed. I did not recognize them. Moving closer, I noticed labels written in black marker across the sides. Storage. Old documents. Donations. My stomach tightened slightly. Slowly, I opened the top box nearest the window. Inside sat photo albums. Walter's old fishing magazines. Framed pictures from family vacations years ago. Another box contained holiday decorations I specifically remembered storing downstairs in the basement after Christmas last year. I stared at the boxes while cold pressure spread through my chest. Nobody had asked before moving these things. Nobody even mentioned it. Then I noticed one final box near the closet partially covered by a blanket. Across the side, written clearly in Claire's handwriting, were 4 words that made my hands suddenly go numb. Margaret's room, sort later. For several long seconds, I could not breathe properly. The guest room around me blurred softly while the furnace clicked somewhere downstairs. Sort later. Not help Margaret organize. Not family storage. Sort later. Like my life had become a task waiting patiently on someone else's schedule. I lowered myself slowly onto the edge of the bed while memories started surfacing one after another. Claire suggesting I move downstairs because stairs become dangerous at your age. Claire insisting I no longer needed access to certain financial folders because Ethan can handle paperwork now. Claire gently correcting me during conversations whenever I forgot tiny details. At the time, each moment felt too small to question. But sitting there inside that dim guest room, staring at boxes filled with pieces of my life already being reorganized without permission, I finally understood something deeply unsettling. They were not preparing this house for my comfort. They were preparing it for a future where I no longer belonged inside it. The next morning, I woke before sunrise with the uneasy feeling that someone had rearranged the walls of my life while I slept. Snow still covered the backyard in smooth white layers beyond the bedroom windows, untouched except for bird tracks near Walter's old feeder beside the fence. I lay there quietly for several minutes, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead while memories from the guest room replayed through my mind. Margaret's room, sort later. Those 4 words kept echoing louder than they should have. Maybe because they were not written with anger. Anger would have been easier to understand. Those words were organized, planned, practical. That was what frightened me most. Downstairs, the house felt colder than usual despite the heat running steadily through the vents. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen counter wrapped in Walter's old gray cardigan while pale winter light filled the room gradually. The clock above the stove ticked softly beside the refrigerator hum. Ordinary sounds. Familiar sounds. Yet everything inside the house suddenly felt fragile, as though I had accidentally discovered something I was never meant to see. Around 10 o'clock, my phone rang. Ethan. I stared at his name on the screen before answering. Morning, Mom, he said quickly. Too quickly. How are you feeling today? Feeling. Another careful word people use when they are checking whether someone noticed more than they should have. I am fine, I answered calmly. How is Lily? Good. Claire is taking her shopping later. Silence lingered awkwardly between us for a moment. I could hear keyboard clicking faintly in the background, probably from Ethan's office downtown. He used to call me just to talk sometimes. About football games. About work stress. About recipes he missed from childhood. Now every conversation sounded scheduled somehow. Managed. Mom, he finally said, lowering his voice slightly. Claire mentioned you seemed upset after dinner. Of course she did. Claire never confronted discomfort directly. She redirected it through Ethan instead. I walked slowly toward the dining room while holding the phone against my ear. Morning light stretched across Walter's old table, illuminating tiny scratches and faded rings from decades of family meals. I found some boxes upstairs last night, I said quietly. The silence on Ethan's end arrived instantly. Heavy silence. Guilty silence. Those were just temporary, he replied after a moment. Claire was helping organize things. Organize things. I looked around the dining room at framed photographs lining the walls. Ethan at age 9 holding a baseball trophy beside Walter. Christmas mornings beside the fireplace. Lily as a baby asleep in my arms. Did anyone plan on mentioning it to me? Another pause. Then Ethan sighed softly. Mom, you are reading too much into this. I closed my eyes briefly because suddenly I remembered Walter saying those exact same words years ago whenever Ethan lied about breaking curfew in high school. Ethan always paused too long before dishonest answers. Some habits survive adulthood. What exactly are you and Claire planning? I asked. Nothing dramatic, he answered. Quickly. We have just been discussing long-term options. Long-term options. There it was again. That strange corporate language people use when they want emotional decisions to sound reasonable. Claire thinks the house may eventually become difficult for you alone. Eventually. Not now. Not urgent. Just slowly planting the idea until resistance feels irrational later. I moved toward the living room window and watched snow slide softly from tree branches outside. Does Claire also think my memories are difficult to manage? Ethan sounded tired suddenly. Mom, please do not make this into something ugly. Ugly. Interesting choice of word. As though my discomfort threatened the peaceful image everyone worked so hard to maintain. Before I could answer, another voice floated faintly through the phone in the background. Claire, ask her if she still has the financial folders from Walter's office. My stomach tightened immediately. Ethan lowered his voice again. Mom, do you still have Dad's insurance paperwork and property records? I stared silently toward Walter's recliner near the fireplace. Nobody had mentioned those documents in years. Why? Ethan hesitated. Then Claire's voice came again, softer this time, but still audible enough. Tell her we are trying to help. Help. That word nearly made me laugh. Because suddenly every small moment from the last 2 years started clicking together inside my head with terrifying clarity. Claire offering to simplify my bills. Claire asking detailed questions about Walter's retirement accounts. Claire insisting Ethan should eventually take over household responsibilities. None of it happened suddenly. She operated slowly, patiently, like someone removing bricks from a foundation one at a time until the entire structure collapses quietly on its own. And standing there alone in my silent living room while my son waited nervously through the phone line, I realized something that chilled me far more than the winter outside. Claire was not trying to become part of this family. She was carefully redesigning it around herself. That afternoon, I found myself standing inside Walter's old workshop for the first time in nearly 6 months. The small detached garage behind the house still smelled faintly of cedar wood, machine oil, and the peppermint gum Walter chewed while working on furniture projects late into the night. Dust floated through narrow beams of winter sunlight cutting across the room from the high windows. His tools remained exactly where he left them. Hammer hanging beside the pegboard. Tape measure curled neatly near the workbench. Half-finished birdhouse sitting untouched in the corner beside paint cans that had probably dried solid years ago. I ran my fingers slowly across the wooden workbench while memories pressed heavily against my chest. Walter believed people revealed themselves most clearly through small habits. Watch how someone treats things that do not belong to them, he used to say. That tells you everything. At the time, I thought he was talking about borrowed tools or neighborly manners. Now I wondered if he understood much more than I realized before he died. Near the back wall sat an old filing cabinet Walter used for house records and insurance documents. Ethan mentioned the paperwork earlier that morning. For some reason, that conversation would not leave me alone. Slowly, I unlocked the bottom drawer and pulled the folders out one by one onto the workbench. Property taxes, retirement statements, insurance policies. The familiar smell of old paper and dust filled the room while snow drifted quietly outside beyond the frosted windows. Then halfway through the stack, I noticed a folder I did not recognize. Thin gray cover. No label on the front. My stomach tightened instinctively before I even opened it. Inside sat several printed pages clipped neatly together. Nursing care estimates. Assisted living comparisons. Long-term senior housing options within 50 miles of Cedar Grove. My pulse began beating harder inside my ears. Some pages contained handwritten notes in blue ink beside pricing information. House could be sold quickly in current market. Downsize furniture. Minimal transition stress if framed as temporary support. I knew Claire's handwriting immediately. Clean. Precise. Controlled. I lowered myself slowly onto Walter's stool while staring at the pages spread across the workbench. They were not casually researching options. They were planning logistics. My house. My belongings. My future. Like a business project already halfway completed. Then I noticed one final document clipped beneath the others. Estimated property valuation for my home. Recent market appraisal included. My throat tightened painfully. Walter built this house himself before Ethan was born. Every hallway carried pieces of our lives together. The pencil marks still hidden inside the laundry room where we measured Ethan's height growing up. The crack near the fireplace from the winter pipe burst in 1987. The kitchen window Walter insisted on widening because he knew I loved watching snow fall while cooking dinner. And now strangers had assigned the entire place a market value printed neatly at the bottom of a page. Suddenly the workshop door creaked open behind me. I turned quickly. Claire stood in the doorway wearing a long cream coat dusted lightly with snowflakes. For a brief second, surprise crossed her face before disappearing beneath that polished calm expression she always carried. I thought I heard someone out here, she said softly. I looked down at the papers spread across Walter's workbench between us. Claire stepped inside slowly, closing the door behind her. Margaret, she said carefully, you were never supposed to find those yet. Yet. Not, those mean nothing. Not denial. Just timing. The coldness of that realization settled deeply into my bones. How long have you been planning this? I asked quietly. Claire removed her gloves one finger at a time before answering. Long-term care conversations are normal for families. I stared at her. Selling my house is also normal. Her expression barely shifted. This property is far too large for one person now. Property. Not home. Never home. Claire walked closer toward the workbench, heels clicking softly against the concrete floor. Margaret, nobody is trying to hurt you. Strange how people always say that moments before admitting exactly what they are doing. Ethan worries constantly about you being alone here. Ethan never worried until you told him to. Silence filled the workshop instantly after those words. Claire's eyes narrowed almost invisibly. Tiny movement. But enough. You think I manipulated your son, she said calmly. I think you convinced him practicality matters more than loyalty. For the first time since I met her, Claire stopped smiling entirely. The room suddenly felt much colder. Walter built a beautiful life for this family, she replied evenly. But sentimentality does not solve aging. I looked around the workshop at Walter's unfinished projects, his carefully organized tools, the family photographs pinned beside the calendar still hanging on the wall from the year he died. Then I looked back at Claire standing there beneath the pale winter light. And at last I understood the real difference between us. Claire saw aging as inconvenience. Walter saw it as history. And history only matters to people capable of love deeper than usefulness. After Claire left the workshop that afternoon, I remained sitting alone beside Walter's workbench long after the winter light faded from the windows. The papers still rested spread across the wood between scattered screws and old measuring tools like evidence from a crime nobody intended to call cruel. Outside, snow continued falling steadily across the backyard while darkness settled softly over Cedar Grove. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to stop defending my own family inside my head. That realization hurt more than anything Claire had said, because mothers become experts at rewriting painful truths into softer versions we can survive emotionally. We call neglect busyness. We call distance adulthood. We call manipulation misunderstanding. Sitting there in Walter's workshop, I finally understood how exhausting it becomes carrying everyone else's excuses while your own heartbreak quietly grows heavier underneath them. By the time I returned inside the house, the rooms felt strangely unfamiliar. Not because anything physically changed, but because I could suddenly see everything differently. The hallway photographs, the quiet kitchen, even the living room furniture Walter and I picked together after Ethan graduated. College. Every object now carried the uncomfortable awareness that someone else had already started imagining this home without me in it. I made myself tea even though my hands trembled too badly to hold the kettle properly at first. Then I carried the cup into the living room and sat beside the lamp near Walter's recliner. The grandfather clock near the staircase ticked steadily through the silence. Same rhythm it kept for 27 years. Walter loved that clock because his father owned one exactly like it. A home should sound alive, he used to say. I stared at the clock for a long time before finally reaching for the old cedar box Walter kept beside the bookshelf. Inside were letters, birthday cards, retirement notes from coworkers, small pieces of a lifetime preserved carefully in fading envelopes and yellow paper. Near the bottom, beneath old photographs from family vacations, I found something I had completely forgotten existed. Walter's leather journal. He rarely wrote in it. But after his diagnosis, he started filling pages late at night when he thought I was asleep. Slowly, I opened it. Most entries were ordinary. Thoughts about treatment appointments, repairs needed around the house, memories about Ethan growing up. Then several pages near the middle caught my attention immediately. Claire means well, but she controls every room she enters. I froze. Walter's handwriting remained strong despite the shaking lines near the end of certain sentences. Ethan stops thinking for himself around her sometimes. Another entry several weeks later read, Margaret still trusts too easily. I worry she does not see what is changing inside this family. My throat tightened painfully. Walter noticed it long before I did. Maybe not the nursing home plan specifically. Maybe not the paperwork. But he saw the slow shift happening around us while I kept convincing myself harmony still existed. One final entry near the back of the journal made tears finally sting behind my eyes. If anything happens to me, Margaret will need protection more than money. Because lonely people are easiest to move out of the way. I closed the journal carefully against my chest while the house creaked softly around me. Walter understood something I refused to admit after he died. Families do not fall apart all at once. They erode slowly through silence, avoidance, and small acts of emotional convenience repeated often enough that nobody notices the damage until it is too late. The following evening, Lily came over unexpectedly while Ethan and Claire attended some work dinner downtown. Ethan asked if I could watch her for a few hours. I agreed immediately because Lily was the only person in the family who still moved through this house naturally, without tension or careful politeness. She sat cross-legged on the living room rug coloring snowmen, while old Christmas movies played softly on television. Around bedtime, I tucked her into the guest room upstairs beneath the patchwork quilt Walter's mother made decades ago. "Grandma," she whispered sleepily once I turned off the lamp. "Yes, sweetheart." Lily hugged her stuffed rabbit tighter against her chest before answering. Mom says families have to make hard choices sometimes. Cold pressure settled instantly beneath my ribs. I sat slowly on the edge of the bed beside her. What kind of choices? Lily shrugged innocently. She says big houses cost too much and old people get lonely easier. Old people, not grandparents, not names, just categories. Claire was teaching even Lily to speak about aging like a problem waiting for management. Did your mom say anything else? Lily hesitated briefly. Then quietly she whispered words that left the entire room feeling suddenly colder. She said once you move somewhere smaller, Daddy will finally stop feeling guilty all the time. I remained perfectly still beside the bed while snow brushed softly against the windows outside. And in that moment, hearing my granddaughter repeat truths adults thought children never understood, I realized something heartbreaking at last. Ethan already knew exactly what Claire was planning. The only thing left now was whether he still remembered enough love to stop her. The following Sunday arrived beneath heavy gray clouds and freezing rain that coated the streets of Cedar Grove in thin layers of ice. I spent most of the afternoon preparing dinner because routine felt safer than grief. Walter always said a quiet kitchen could steady a troubled mind better than any conversation. So I peeled potatoes slowly at the sink while beef stew simmered across the stove and jazz music played softly through the old radio near the refrigerator. Outside, tree branches bent under freezing rain while headlights blurred past the front windows in streaks of gold. By 6 o'clock, the house smelled like rosemary, onions, and fresh bread cooling beside the counter. Everything looked warm, comfortable, almost normal. But underneath that normalcy, something colder waited quietly at the table. Ethan arrived first carrying 2 bottles of wine while shaking rainwater from his coat near the door. He hugged me briefly, distracted again, but this time I noticed something else beneath his tired expression. Nervousness. Real nervousness. Smells good in here, he said, glancing around the kitchen too quickly. Claire and Lily are right behind me. Claire entered a minute later wearing a fitted camel-colored coat and polished leather boots that clicked sharply across the hardwood floor. She smiled immediately the second she saw me. That perfect smile again. Controlled. Elegant. Empty. Margaret, this house always feels so cozy, she said while placing a bakery box onto the counter. Nobody makes dinners like this anymore. Strange how people compliment traditions most right before replacing them. During dinner, conversation drifted harmlessly at first. Lily talked excitedly about her school concert while Ethan described delays at work caused by budget restructuring downtown. Claire nodded at appropriate moments, refilling glasses and passing dishes with practiced grace. To anyone watching through the windows, we probably looked like a close family sharing another peaceful Sunday evening together. Then halfway through dinner, Claire placed her fork down carefully beside her plate and smiled toward Ethan. Did you tell your mother about the realtor appointment tomorrow? The room went completely still. Ethan froze mid-reach beside the breadbasket while heat rushed slowly into my face. Realtor? I repeated quietly. Claire blinked as though surprised by my confusion. Oh, she looked toward Ethan gently. I assumed you already discussed it. Ethan rubbed both hands together beneath the table before answering. Mom, it is not finalized or anything. Not finalized. Another business phrase replacing plain honesty. I folded my napkin carefully beside my plate. What exactly is not finalized? Claire stepped in before Ethan could answer. We have simply been exploring practical possibilities for the future. There was that word again. Practical. Claire used it the way surgeons use anesthesia. To numb people before cutting something away. Selling this house could provide flexibility for everyone, she continued calmly. And there are some beautiful retirement communities closer to downtown now. Retirement communities. Such polished language for removing someone from their own life gradually enough that guilt stays manageable afterward. Lily stopped eating and stared nervously between us while rain tapped harder against the dining room windows. Ethan finally spoke again, voice low. Mom, maintaining this place alone is becoming unrealistic. Unrealistic. I looked slowly around the dining room at Walter's handmade table, the family photographs lining the walls, the grandfather clock ticking softly near the staircase. Unrealistic. Your father built this house himself, I said quietly. Ethan exhaled heavily. Dad is gone now. The words hit the room like shattered glass. Instant silence followed. Even Claire looked briefly uncomfortable before lowering her eyes toward her wine glass. I stared at my son across the candlelight, while something deep inside me finally stopped trying to protect him emotionally. Because people reveal their real loyalties most clearly when they become impatient with memory. Yes, I answered softly. He is gone. Ethan looked down immediately, shame flickering across his face for only a second before disappearing beneath exhaustion. Claire reached gently for his hand beneath the table. Nobody is trying to hurt you, Margaret, she said smoothly. We are trying to make responsible decisions before things become difficult later. I almost smiled hearing that. Because for months I kept asking myself whether Claire truly understood the pain she caused, or whether she simply lacked emotional awareness entirely. But sitting there beneath the warm dining room lights watching her comfort my guilty son while discussing the sale of my home like a financial strategy meeting, I finally understood the truth. Claire understood exactly what she was doing. She just believed efficiency mattered more than sentiment. And perhaps the most heartbreaking realization of all was this. Ethan no longer looked shocked by her plans. He looked tired from carrying them. Dinner ended shortly afterward beneath strained politeness and unfinished wine glasses. But long after Claire and Ethan left that night, one sentence kept echoing through the silent house louder than anything else. Dad is gone now. Because what my son truly meant was much colder than grief. He meant the only person who once protected my place in this family was no longer alive to stop them. After that dinner, the house no longer felt wounded. It felt awake. There is a difference. Pain makes you grieve. Awareness makes you observe. For the first time in years, I stopped seeing Claire as merely difficult or controlling. I started seeing patterns instead. Small details. Rearranged details. Strategic details. The following week, I noticed Ethan calling less frequently unless Claire sat nearby during conversations. If he phoned alone from work, his voice softened slightly, almost like the old Ethan returning for a few brief minutes before disappearing again. But whenever Claire entered the room, his tone changed immediately. More careful, more rehearsed. It reminded me of boys in high school checking their answers before speaking in front of strict teachers. One snowy Thursday afternoon, I drove downtown to buy groceries and pick up Walter's prescription records from the pharmacy archive. Cedar Grove looked beautiful beneath fresh snowfall. Small storefronts glowed warmly against the gray sky, while people hurried through icy sidewalks carrying shopping bags and coffee cups. I parked beside Miller's Bakery and stood for a moment watching steam rise from vents along Main Street. Years ago, Walter and I spent entire Saturdays downtown during winter. Breakfast at the diner, hardware store visits, coffee beside the river before sunset. Simple routines become sacred once the people attached to them disappear. Inside the pharmacy, the young cashier smiled politely while retrieving old insurance paperwork from storage. Take your time, I told her softly. I am in no rush. That was not entirely true. Lately, I felt time moving differently around me. Faster somehow. Like everyone else already knew something about my future that I had only recently discovered myself. When I returned home later that afternoon, Ethan's truck sat parked in the driveway unexpectedly. My stomach tightened immediately. Inside, voices drifted faintly from Walter's office near the back hallway. Claire's voice. Low. Controlled. Ethan sounded tense. I removed my coat quietly beside the front door before hearing Claire say something that stopped me cold in the hallway. If we wait too long, she will become emotionally impossible to move. Move. Not help. Not support. Move. Ethan exhaled heavily. Claire, she is still my mother. And I am thinking long-term for this family, Claire answered calmly. You know how expensive assisted care becomes if emergencies happen suddenly. I stood frozen near the hallway wall while cold pressure spread through my chest. There it was. The real conversation finally spoken aloud without softening the language for my comfort. Claire continued speaking gently, almost professionally. Once the house sells, everything becomes easier. Lower maintenance. Better financial flexibility. Less stress for everyone. Everyone. Strange how plans designed around removing one person always get framed as benefiting everyone else. Ethan remained silent long enough that I almost walked away before hearing him speak again quietly. She is going to hate me. Claire's answer came immediately. Only temporarily. Temporary. Like grief. Like betrayal. Like mothers eventually forgetting they once mattered. I stepped backward silently before they realized I was home and moved carefully toward the kitchen. My hands trembled while setting grocery bags onto the counter. Beside the sink, through the window above the faucet, snow drifted steadily across the backyard, where Walter once built snow forts for Ethan every winter after heavy storms. Suddenly I could hear laughter from those old days, so clearly in my memory, it nearly hurt physically. Ethan running through snowbanks wearing oversized gloves. Walter pretending to lose snowball fights on purpose. Me watching through this exact kitchen window while soup simmered on the stove. Families never realize they are creating future grief while living ordinary happy moments. A few minutes later, Claire entered the kitchen carrying her usual polished smile. "Margaret," she said warmly, "we did not hear you come in." I looked directly at her while unpacking apples beside the counter. "That is because you were busy discussing where to move me." Her expression barely changed. Barely, but enough. Ethan appeared behind her almost instantly, guilt already visible across his face. "Mom, please," he started quietly. I raised one hand gently before he could continue. "No," I said calmly. "I think I finally understand everything very clearly now." Silence settled heavily through the kitchen while the refrigerator hummed softly nearby. Claire folded both hands together carefully. "Margaret, you are misunderstanding responsible planning." I almost admired her composure at that moment. Truly, most people at least stumble when confronted directly. Claire simply reorganized reality mid-conversation, like someone adjusting table decorations before guests arrive. "You already boxed up my belongings," I replied softly. "You researched nursing homes. You contacted realtors. You discussed selling Walter's house while standing beneath family photographs." Ethan looked physically ill now, but Claire remained steady. "This home represents memories to you," she said evenly. "To Ethan, it represents pressure." I stared at my son then. Really stared at him. And what broke my heart most was not betrayal itself. It was exhaustion. Ethan no longer looked like a man fighting for his family. He looked like someone too tired to resist the person controlling it. That night, after Ethan and Claire finally left the house, I sat alone in Walter's recliner without turning any lights on except the lamp beside the staircase. Snow covered the windows in pale silver shadows while the grandfather clock ticked steadily through the silence. For years, I believed surviving grief meant learning how to live without the person you loved. But I was beginning to understand something much harder. Sometimes grief also means realizing the people still alive no longer love you the same way. The realization did not make me cry this time. Tears belonged to confusion. What I felt now was clarity, cold and quiet. I looked around the living room slowly. Walter's framed military photograph above the fireplace. Ethan's childhood baseball glove still resting on the bookshelf where Walter placed it years ago after a championship game. The crocheted blanket folded carefully across the couch arm. Every object inside this house carried fingerprints of a life built through loyalty, sacrifice, and memory. Claire saw square footage and market value. Walter saw history. And perhaps that was why she could never understand what she was actually trying to erase. Around midnight, I walked upstairs and opened Walter's old closet. Inside the back corner sat the small black lockbox containing our legal documents. Retirement records, insurance papers, property deed. And beneath all of it, the original will Walter and I created together nearly 15 years ago. I carried the box downstairs carefully and spread everything across the dining room table beneath the chandelier Walter installed himself one summer while refusing to hire electricians because he claimed instructions are just suggestions. I smiled faintly remembering that. Then the smile disappeared once I looked back at the paperwork. Everything currently transferred directly to Ethan after my death. The house, savings, Walter's workshop tools, family heirlooms passed down through generations. At the time, leaving everything to our son felt obvious. Natural. We trusted love more than caution. But people change slowly in ways older versions of them would never recognize. The next morning, I called Richard Bennett, the attorney Walter trusted for over 20 years. His office overlooked Main Street above the old bookstore downtown. "Margaret," he said warmly once I arrived later that afternoon, "it has been far too long." Richard looked older now, more silver hair, slightly slower movements. But his eyes sharpened immediately the second I explained why I came. We sat across from each other inside his quiet office while snow drifted outside tall windows overlooking Cedar Grove. "I need to make changes," I said simply. Richard studied me carefully for a moment before nodding once. I assumed this day might eventually come. Those words startled me slightly. Walter worried, Richard explained softly. Not about Ethan exactly. About influence. Influence. Such a polite word for emotional erosion. I stared down at my gloves folded neatly across my lap, while Richard opened the old family files from storage cabinets behind his desk. Your husband once told me something interesting, Richard continued quietly. He said families rarely collapse because of hatred. They collapse because someone slowly convinces good people that loyalty has become inconvenient. My throat tightened painfully hearing Walter described so clearly after all this time. We spent nearly 3 hours reviewing documents that afternoon. By the end, several things changed permanently. The house would no longer transfer directly to Ethan. Instead, ownership would move into a preservation trust protecting the property from sale until Lily turned 30 years old. Walter's workshop and historical furniture collection would be donated to the Cedar Grove Historical Society rather than liquidated privately. Certain investment accounts would fund scholarships for local trade school students in Walter's name. Ethan would still inherit eventually, but not immediately, not carelessly, not through Claire's timeline. As Richard finalized paperwork, he looked at me gently across the desk. Do you want me to prepare family notification documents? I thought for a moment before shaking my head slowly. No, let them continue believing I know nothing. Because suddenly I understood something important. Claire's greatest advantage had never been manipulation alone. It was certainty. She believed I remained too lonely, too emotional, too old to protect myself strategically. She mistook kindness for weakness the same way many polished people do. That evening, I stopped by the grocery store before driving home. Near the frozen food aisle, I unexpectedly ran into Ethan. He looked startled seeing me standing there beside shopping carts filled with bread and soup cans. Mom, he said quickly. I was actually going to call you. He looked exhausted again, dark circles beneath his eyes. Shirt wrinkled beneath his winter coat, like he had slept poorly for days. For a moment, I saw the little boy who used to wait by the window for Walter to come home from work every evening. Then the moment disappeared. Claire says we should all have dinner Sunday, he continued carefully. Talk openly. Talk openly. Interesting phrase considering how long they spent speaking around me instead of to me. I nodded once. That sounds fine. Ethan studied my face uncertainly, almost as though my calmness unsettled him more than anger would have. Mom, he asked quietly, are you all right? I looked directly at my son standing beneath fluorescent grocery store lights while strangers pushed carts quietly around us. Then I answered with more honesty than he probably expected. No, Ethan, but I am finally awake. Sunday evening arrived beneath heavy snowfall that turned Cedar Grove quiet and almost unreal beneath layers of white. The streetlights outside my house glowed softly through the storm while wind brushed snow against the windows in slow waves. I spent most of the afternoon preparing dinner the same way I had prepared hundreds of family dinners before this one. Pot roast in the oven. Walter's favorite glazed carrots. Homemade rolls cooling beneath folded kitchen towels. But unlike every dinner before, I no longer cooked to preserve peace. I cooked because some endings deserve dignity. By 6 o'clock, the dining room looked warm beneath candlelight reflecting across Walter's oak table. The same table where Ethan once spilled grape juice during Little League celebrations. The same table where Walter held my hand quietly after we learned about his diagnosis. Families leave emotional fingerprints on ordinary objects. That was something Claire never understood because she measured value through usefulness instead of memory. Ethan and Claire arrived exactly on time. Lily rushed inside, first carrying a paper snowflake from school, while Ethan followed behind her looking tense enough to break under his own thoughts. Claire entered last wearing another elegant cream sweater with gold earrings catching the soft chandelier light. She smiled immediately upon seeing the dining room. Everything looks beautiful, Margaret. I nodded politely. Sit down before dinner gets cold. Throughout the meal, conversation stayed painfully careful. Lily talked about Christmas songs she learned at school, while Claire complimented the food, and Ethan barely touched his plate at all. Every few minutes, I caught him glancing toward me nervously, almost like a child waiting for punishment after breaking something valuable. The storm outside intensified gradually, wind rattling branches against the windows, while snow buried the backyard deeper beneath darkness. Finally, after dessert plates sat half-finished beside coffee cups, I folded my napkin carefully across my lap and looked directly at Claire. I met with Richard Bennett this week. Silence arrived instantly around the table. Ethan's face drained of color before Claire even reacted. Richard, Ethan repeated quietly. Why? I held his gaze calmly. Because I finally realized something important. Nobody was planning to ask what I wanted. You were planning to inform me after decisions had already been made. Claire set her coffee cup down gently onto the saucer. Margaret, this conversation does not need to become hostile. Hostile. Another polished word designed to shame emotional honesty. I almost smiled. You researched nursing homes before speaking to me once. Claire remained composed, but I noticed her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table. We were trying to prepare responsibly. You boxed my belongings before telling me there was even a plan. Ethan lowered his head immediately. Claire answered anyway. Transitions are easier when organized early. There it was again. That cold efficiency disguised as care. Lily looked nervously between us while the grandfather clock ticked loudly through the silence near the staircase. Then I reached calmly beside my chair and placed a folder onto the dining table between us. Ethan stared at it immediately. Claire did not move at all. What is that? Ethan asked softly. Updated legal documents, I answered. The house will no longer be sold after my death. Claire's expression changed for the first time since I met her. Not dramatically, but enough. Tiny cracks finally appearing beneath years of controlled politeness. Ethan opened the folder slowly while snow battered the windows harder outside. His eyes moved quickly across the paperwork. Then slower. Then still. A preservation trust, he whispered. The property cannot be liquidated? No, I said quietly. Not by anyone. Claire finally spoke, voice calmer than most people could manage under pressure. Margaret, making emotional decisions out of fear benefits nobody. I looked directly at her across the candlelight. No, Claire. Emotional decisions built this family. Love built this house. Loyalty built our traditions. The problem is that you mistake those things for weakness because you have only ever understood value once it can be sold. The room fell completely silent afterward except for wind moving through the storm outside. Ethan looked shattered now. Truly shattered. Like someone finally seeing the damage beneath years of carefully managed explanations. Mom, he whispered hoarsely. I never wanted you to feel unwanted. My chest tightened painfully hearing that because deep down, I believed him. Ethan never became cruel intentionally. He simply became passive long enough for someone else to reshape his priorities around convenience. I know, I answered softly. That is what makes this so heartbreaking. Claire stood slowly from the table then, composure finally slipping beneath visible frustration. You are turning this family against itself over a house. I shook my head gently. No, the house only revealed what was already happening. Claire stared at me for several seconds beneath the warm dining room lights, while snowstorm shadows moved softly across the walls behind her. Then for the first time since entering our lives, she stopped trying to sound kind. You cannot hold on to the past forever, Margaret. I looked around the room one final time. Walter's photographs, Ethan's childhood memories, Lily sitting quietly beside unfinished pie, the table carrying 4 decades of laughter and grief alike. Then I answered with complete calm. No, Claire. But families who forget their past usually lose each other completely. And standing there inside the warm dining room, while winter storms buried Cedar Grove outside, I finally understood the saddest truth of all. The smiles around our dinner table had never been proof of happiness. They were camouflage hiding how far apart we had already drifted long before anyone admitted it aloud.